Every civilization believes it will be the exception. Smarter than the last, stronger, more advanced, too big to fail. But the ruins of the past were built by people who believed the same thing. Empires did not collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because they were confident. This is not the story of one civilization. It is the pattern behind all of them. And once you see it, you will never look at the modern world the same way again. Everything you touch today has a past that reaches far deeper than most people realize. Long before modern nations, before borders, before money as we know it, human beings were already experimenting with power, control, and survival. Civilization did not appear suddenly. It was built slowly, painfully, and often violently, through thousands of years of trial and error. Early humans did not wake up one day and decide to create cities. They were pushed into them by fear, scarcity, and the constant threat of chaos. In the earliest days, survival was personal. Families and small groups depended entirely on their own strength, their knowledge of the land, and their ability to cooperate. There were no laws, no rulers, and no systems to fall back on. If food ran out, people starved. If conflict erupted, it was settled through direct violence. Life was uncertain, short, and fragile. Everything began to change when humans learned how to control food. Farming created stability, but it also created dependence. Once people stayed in one place, they became tied to land, seasons, and each other. Villages grew larger, strangers lived side by side, and cooperation was no longer optional. With growth came new problems: disputes over land, arguments over resources, and competition for power. These problems could not be solved with strength alone. This was the moment civilization truly began, not as a dream of progress, but as a solution to fear. Rules were created to prevent constant violence. Leaders emerged to enforce order. Walls were built to separate safety from danger. What we call civilization was not designed to make people happy. It was designed to make life predictable. And predictability, even when harsh, was better than chaos. As the first settlements grew into cities, daily life became more complicated than survival alone. People now lived among hundreds, sometimes thousands of others. This created opportunity, but it also created tension. Noise filled the streets. Animals, smoke, and waste crowded narrow paths. Disease spread easily. Fire was a constant danger. Yet people stayed, because cities offered something the wild never could: protection and structure. Walls kept enemies out, markets kept food moving, and shared labor made massive projects possible. In cities, individuals no longer needed to know how to do everything. Specialization was born. Some people became builders, others metal workers, others priests or scribes. This made societies stronger, but it also made them dependent. When one part of the system failed, many suffered. With dependence came the need for control. Informal agreements were no longer enough. Disputes over land, food, and labor became common. Personal revenge threatened to tear cities apart from the inside. To prevent constant violence, rulers claimed the authority to judge and punish. Justice became centralized. The state took ownership of conflict. Laws were created not to ensure fairness, but to ensure stability. Punishments were severe because fear worked faster than understanding. A predictable punishment discouraged rebellion more effectively than moral reasoning. People learned quickly that obedience meant survival. Over time, these rules shaped how people thought. Authority became normal. Questioning power became dangerous. What began as a solution to chaos slowly hardened into a system that favored those at the top. Civilization was no longer just a way to live together. It became a structure that decided who mattered, who worked, and who paid the price for order. As cities expanded, something subtle but powerful began to change in the human mind. People no longer identified only with their family or tribe. They now belonged to something larger: a city, a ruler, a system. This shift created loyalty, but it also created distance. Decisions that affected thousands were now made by a few. To manage growing populations, record keeping became essential. This is where writing emerged, not as poetry or storytelling, but as accounting. Lists of grain, records of labor, debts owed and paid. Writing was a tool of control before it was a tool of culture. If something was written down, it became real, permanent, and enforceable. Those who could read and write gained immense power. Scribes were not warriors or kings, but they shaped reality with symbols. They decided who owed what, who worked where, and who had failed their obligations. Most people could not read these marks, but they were still bound by them. Knowledge became a boundary between classes. As administration grew, so did hierarchy. Leaders surrounded themselves with officials, advisors, and enforcers. Power moved upward, away from ordinary people. Decisions felt distant and unchangeable. This created stability, but it also created resentment. The system worked best for those who controlled it. To maintain order, rulers relied less on personal strength and more on legitimacy. Authority needed confirmación. This is where tradition became important. Customs, rituals, and ceremonies reinforced the idea that the system was ancient, natural, and unquestionable. If things had always been this way, then resistance felt dangerous. Over time, obedience became normal. People followed rules not because they agreed with them, but because life without them seemed impossible. Civilization had succeeded in its original goal. Chaos was reduced, violence was controlled, but the cost was subtle. Freedom narrowed, power concentrated, and the system, once created to protect people, began to demand sacrifice in return. As cities stabilized, trade began to stretch beyond local borders. What started as simple exchange between neighbors slowly expanded into regional networks. Goods moved farther than ever before. Copper, tin, grain, textiles, and tools traveled between cities that would never meet face to face. Trade created wealth, but it also created comparison. People began to see who had more, who had less, and who controlled access. To manage trade, value needed to be standardized. This is when weights, measures, and early forms of money appeared. At first, silver was not currency in the modern sense. It was a unit of account, a way to measure labor, goods, and obligation. Once value could be measured, it could be stored. Once it could be stored, it could be controlled. Those who controlled storage controlled survival. Temples and palaces became economic centers. They collected surplus, distributed rations, and issued loans. Farmers borrowed seed and tools during hard seasons, expecting to repay later. Sometimes they could. Sometimes they could not. Failure did not erase the debt, it multiplied it. Debt changed the meaning of freedom. A person could be alive, working, and technically free, yet trapped by obligation. Land was seized first, then labor, then family members were used as guarantees. This process was legal, recorded, and enforced by the state. Violence was no longer required. Numbers did the work. Over time, inequality hardened. Wealth stopped being temporary and became inherited. Children born into powerful families gained access to education, protection, and opportunity. Children born into debt inherited limitation. Civilization created structure, but it did not create equality. It created layers. Each layer depended on the one below it. Trade connected civilizations, but it also spread instability. When supply failed in one region, the effect, debt did more than reshape economies. It reshaped human behavior. Once obligation became numerical, it stopped feeling temporary. A bad year could follow a family for generations. This created a new kind of control, quieter than chains, but just as powerful. People worked not to improve their lives, but to avoid falling further behind. Many ancient societies justified this system as natural. If someone failed to repay a debt, it was framed as personal failure, not systemic design. Responsibility shifted downward. The system itself was never questioned. Numbers appeared neutral, even when they caused suffering. This made inequality easier to accept and harder to challenge. Over time, debt became embedded into law. Contracts were enforced by courts. Records were preserved by scribes. Obligations could be transferred, inherited, and sold. A person's future could be decided by agreements made before they were born. Freedom existed in theory, but not in practice. This system allowed empires to expand without constant violence. Control no longer required armies in the streets. It operated through obligation, fear of punishment, and social pressure. People complied because resistance meant losing everything at once. Silence was safer than protest. Debt also changed relationships between people. Trust gave way to calculation. Community support weakened as survival became individualized. When everyone owed something, generosity became risky. Civilization grew more efficient, but less humane. Yet rulers saw this as success. Stability mattered more than well-being. A population that feared falling was easier to manage than one that believed in upward movement. Debt kept society in motion, but always in the same direction. Upward for a few, downward for many. As societies became more unequal, rulers faced a growing problem. Force alone was not enough to keep order. Armies could suppress rebellion, but they could not rule minds. To maintain long-term stability, power needed justification. This is where religion became inseparable from authority. Belief systems existed long before empires, but civilization reshaped them. Gods were no longer distant spirits. They became organized, hierarchical, and deeply connected to the state. Rulers claimed divine favor. Laws were said to reflect cosmic order. Obedience was framed not just as duty, but as moral necessity. Religion solved a critical problem. It answered questions that power could not. Why must some suffer while others rule? Why must people obey even when the system feels unfair? The answer was simple and unchallengeable. The gods willed it. Questioning authority became dangerous because it also meant questioning the universe itself. Priests emerged as intermediaries. They interpreted signs, controlled rituals, and preserved sacred knowledge. Like scribes, they gained influence without weapons. Their power came from belief. By controlling meaning, they shaped behavior. Fear of divine punishment often worked better than fear of earthly law. Religion also extended control beyond death. Life was temporary, but judgment was eternal. Obedience promised reward after death. Disobedience threatened endless suffering. This made authority permanent. Even escape through death was no longer guaranteed. For ordinary people, faith offered comfort. It gave meaning to hardship and hope in uncertainty. But it also reinforced acceptance. When suffering is sacred, resistance feels sinful. Civilization did not eliminate fear. It redirected it. From chaos in the world to judgment beyond it, ritual became the glue that held civilization together. While laws controlled behavior and religion shaped belief, ritual made authority feel real. Ceremonies marked time, reinforced hierarchy, and reminded people of their place within the system. Coronations, festivals, sacrifices, and public prayers were not optional traditions. They were tools of legitimacy. Rituals worked because they were repetitive. When something is repeated often enough, it stops being questioned. People learned when to bow, when to speak, when to remain silent. These actions trained obedience without the need for force. Authority became familiar, and familiarity felt safe. Festivals played a special role. They released pressure. After long periods of labor, taxation, and control, celebrations offered temporary relief. Music, food, and spectacle created the illusion of unity. During these moments, social divisions seemed to disappear. But once the festival ended, nothing had changed. The structure remained intact. Tradition strengthened this effect. Practices passed down through generations gained weight simply because they were old. If something had always been done a certain way, changing it felt dangerous. Tradition turned systems into heritage. Resistance began to look like betrayal of the past, not improvement of the future. Rulers understood this instinctively. They surrounded themselves with symbols, clothing, architecture, and language designed to feel ancient and permanent. Power was staged. Thrones were elevated. Processions were choreographed. Authority was not only exercised, it was performed. For ordinary people, ritual provided meaning. It offered rhythm in an unpredictable world. It explained suffering and promised continuity. But it also narrowed imagination. When life is structured entirely by ritual and tradition, alternatives become difficult to imagine. Civilization stabilized itself not only through fear, but through habit. Over time, ritual and tradition made systems feel natural. Inequality looked inevitable. Authority looked eternal. What had once been created to manage society now defined reality itself. Civilization had learned how to preserve power without constant violence. As civilization stabilized internally, their attention turned outward. Growth created pressure. Cities needed more land, more resources, and more labor to sustain themselves. Trade could only provide so much. Eventually, expansion became unavoidable. This is when war stopped being occasional and became systemic. Early conflicts were reactive, disputes over territory, water, or honor. But as states matured, war transformed into policy. Armies were no longer temporary groups of fighters. They became permanent institutions. Soldiers trained year-round, weapons were standardized, command structures formed. War was no longer chaos, it was organized labor. Military success depended on discipline more than bravery. Individuals were trained to move as one, to obey commands instantly, and to suppress fear. Identity shifted. A soldier was no longer defined by family or village, but by unit, rank, and loyalty to the state. This created powerful cohesion, but it also erased individuality. War reshaped society beyond the battlefield. Entire economies reorganized around conflict. Farms supplied armies, craftsmen produced weapons, roads were built for movement, not comfort. Even politics changed. Leaders gained legitimacy through conquest. Victory justified authority, failure weakened it. For ordinary people, war was both distant and unavoidable. Many never saw the battlefield, yet their lives were shaped by it. Taxes increased to fund campaigns. Sons were taken for service. Food shortages followed armies. War touched everyone, even those who never fought. Expansion brought wealth and prestige, but it also carried hidden costs. As borders stretched, control weakened, communication slowed, loyalty fractured. The same systems that allowed empires to grow made them vulnerable to overreach. War could build civilizations quickly, but it could also exhaust them just as fast. Civilization had mastered order, belief, and expansion, but it had also tied its survival to constant growth. And growth, once demanded, is never satisfied for long. Behind every expanding empire stood millions of ordinary soldiers. Most did not fight for glory. They fought because the system demanded it. Conscription, obligation, and social pressure filled the ranks. For many young men, military service was not a choice. It was a requirement of survival within the state. Training was designed to erase hesitation. Recruits learned to move together, speak together, and think together. Fear was not eliminated, it was controlled. Discipline replaced instinct. Obedience became automatic. This transformation was essential for organized warfare, but it came at a cost. Individual identity slowly disappeared. Soldiers lived under constant stress. Long marches, harsh discipline, and the threat of punishment shaped daily life. Loyalty to commanders mattered more than personal morality. Orders were followed because hesitation endangered the entire unit. Responsibility dissolved into hierarchy. What mattered was not whether an action was right, but whether it was commanded. When soldiers returned home, many found they no longer belonged. The habits that kept them alive in war made ordinary life difficult. Silence replaced conversation. Violence lingered beneath the surface. Society celebrated victory, not recovery. Trauma was rarely acknowledged. Broken soldiers were expected to resume normal life without support. Militarization also changed culture. Strength became a virtue. Aggression was rewarded. Peace was treated as temporary. Entire generations grew up preparing for conflict they did not yet understand. War shaped language, values, and identity long after battles ended. Empires relied on this system because it worked. Trained armies could suppress rebellion, expand borders, and project power far beyond their core territories. But reliance on constant military readiness hardened societies. Flexibility disappeared. Compassion weakened. The system demanded endurance, even when exhaustion spread. Civilization had learned how to create soldiers efficiently. What it never learned was how to protect the people beneath the armor. As empires expanded, distance became their quiet enemy. What once could be controlled directly now required layers of administration, messengers, and local authorities. Orders took longer to arrive. Information became distorted as it traveled. The center believed it was in control, even as reality at the edges began to slip away. Expansion demanded constant resources, more soldiers, more food, more taxes. Provinces that once benefited from empire began to feel exploited. Wealth flowed toward the center, while responsibility flowed outward. Local populations carried the burden, but decisions were made far away by people who would never see the consequences. Corruption followed naturally. Officials realized their distance from oversight protected them. Taxes were inflated, supplies were skimmed, positions were sold. What began as service slowly transformed into opportunity for personal gain. Trust between rulers and subjects weakened, replaced by resentment and quiet resistance. Elites became isolated from everyday life. Protected by wealth and privilege, they experienced a different reality than the people they governed. Food shortages felt abstract. Military losses were numbers on reports. Warnings from the provinces were dismissed as exaggeration. The system still looked strong from the top. To compensate, rulers doubled down on control. Laws grew harsher, punishments increased, surveillance expanded. These measures created the illusion of stability, but they addressed symptoms, not causes. Pressure continued to build beneath the surface. Overreach rarely feels like failure in the moment. Expansion is celebrated. New territories are praised as progress. But every addition stretches the system thinner. Communication slows. Loyalty weakens. Flexibility disappears. What once made the empire powerful now makes it fragile. Civilization had mastered growth, but it had not learned restraint. And without restraint, even the strongest systems begin to crack under their own success. As pressure increased across the empire, a dangerous gap opened between those who ruled and those who lived under the system. Elites became increasingly insulated from reality. Surrounded by comfort, ceremony, and loyal advisors, they experienced stability while chaos spread elsewhere. This separation made decline difficult to see and easy to deny. Warnings did exist. Reports of unrest, food shortages, and corruption arrived regularly. But information was filtered. Messengers softened bad news. Officials protected themselves by blaming local failures. The system rewarded optimism and punished honesty. Over time, truth became inconvenient. Luxury also changed priorities. Resources meant for infrastructure and defense were redirected toward palaces, celebrations, and personal enrichment. Status mattered more than resilience. Appearance replaced preparation. As long as life at the center remained comfortable, decline felt theoretical. This blindness weakened decision-making. Problems that required reform were met with delay. Structural failures were treated as temporary setbacks. Leaders relied on tradition and authority rather than adaptation. What had worked in the past was assumed to work forever. Meanwhile, ordinary people felt the strain daily. Taxes increased, services declined, trust eroded. Loyalty weakened, not because people became rebellious, but because the system no longer protected them. When survival feels uncertain, obedience loses its meaning. Elite isolation also affected military strength. Commanders were promoted for loyalty rather than competence. Strategy became rigid, innovation slowed. Enemies adapted faster than the empire itself. Victories became rarer and defeats more damaging. By the time elites sensed danger, the foundation was already compromised. Decline does not announce itself with catastrophe. It advances quietly, hidden behind ritual, tradition, and denial. Civilization was still standing, but its core had begun to hollow out. Decline rarely begins with collapse. It begins with small failures that feel manageable. Roads are repaired more slowly. Armies are paid later than promised. Officials enforce laws unevenly. None of these changes seem fatal on their own, but together they signal that the system is losing coherence. People adapt at first. Communities rely more on local networks as central authority weakens. Informal solutions replace official ones. Bribes become common. Rules are bent to survive. What was once corruption becomes routine. The system still exists, but it no longer functions as intended. Economic pressure intensifies these cracks. Trade slows. Coinage is debased. Inflation erodes trust in value. Wages fail to keep up with costs. For the population, life becomes harder without a clear explanation. From the center, statistics replace lived experience. Numbers suggest control, even as reality slips away. Military strain grows alongside economic stress. Soldiers are stretched thin across distant borders. Equipment deteriorates. Training declines. Discipline weakens. The army still looks powerful in ceremony, but its effectiveness quietly fades. Rivals notice long before leaders do. Fear spreads subtly. Not panic, but uncertainty. People sense that the future is less stable than the past. Faith in institutions weakens. Loyalty becomes conditional. Survival takes priority over identity. When systems no longer protect, people stop defending them. Rulers respond predictably. They tighten control. Laws grow harsher. Surveillance expands. Punishment increases. These measures address behavior, not causes. They treat symptoms while accelerating decay. Trust cannot be restored through force. Decline feels confusing because it lacks drama. There is no single moment to point to, no clear turning point. Civilization continues to function, just poorly. From the inside, it feels like endurance. From the outside, it looks like inevitability. Every civilization reaches a moment where pressure becomes impossible to contain. Not because a single disaster strikes, but because too many small failures collide at the same time. This is the breaking point. From the inside, it does not feel dramatic or sudden. It feels heavy, exhausting, and confusing. Systems that once absorbed stress begin to fail together, overwhelming structures that once held society in place. Food shortages become more frequent. Not complete famine, but inconsistency. Supplies arrive late, in smaller quantities, or not at all. Prices rise without explanation. Markets grow unstable. People adapt by hoarding, trading privately, or leaving cities altogether. Trust in official distribution weakens. Survival slowly becomes personal again, reversing centuries of centralized control. Political authority fractures in visible ways. Orders from the center are ignored, delayed, or selectively enforced. Local leaders act independently, prioritizing their own regions over distant rulers. Laws that once felt absolute now feel negotiable. The state still exists on paper, but its presence fades from daily life. Power breaks into smaller, competing centers, each focused on self-preservation. Violence returns, but not as organized war. It emerges as instability. Banditry increases along roads once protected by the state. Local conflicts erupt over land, water, and resources. Travel becomes dangerous. Trade routes collapse. Movement slows. Civilization begins to contract inward, shrinking rather than expanding. The military, once the backbone of empire, struggles to respond. Troops are underpaid or unpaid. Supplies fail to arrive. Equipment deteriorates. Morale collapses. Loyalty becomes uncertain. Soldiers begin protecting their own communities rather than distant authorities. The army still looks impressive in numbers, but it no longer functions as a unified force. Elites attempt to restore control through force. Emergency powers are declared. Punishments become harsher. Surveillance increases. Scapegoats are blamed. Minor victories are exaggerated as proof of recovery. But these actions reveal desperation, not strength. Authority that relies only on fear has already lost legitimacy. People sense the shift even if they cannot explain it. Faith in the future fades. Long-term planning stops. Families focus on immediate survival rather than legacy. Migration increases. Birth rates decline. The idea of civilization as a permanent structure disappears from imagination. This moment is not collapse yet. It is hesitation. A society suspended between continuity and disintegration. Some believe recovery is still possible. Others quietly prepare for the end. History shows that once this stage is reached, reversal is rare. The breaking point is not loud. It is heavy. It presses down on every part of life at once. Civilization does not fall in a single moment. It bends under accumulated weight, unable to support itself any longer. Collapse is the moment history remembers, but it is not the moment people expect. By the time collapse becomes visible, society has already been failing for years. What changes now is speed. Systems that once weakened slowly begin to fail all at once. Recovery stops being realistic. Survival takes its place. Cities feel the impact first. Food deliveries stop arriving on time. Wells and irrigation systems fall into disrepair. Streets grow unsafe. Authority retreats behind walls or disappears entirely. The promises that once held people together lose meaning. Citizens realize the state can no longer protect them, feed them, or enforce order consistently. Trade collapses next. Long-distance routes become too dangerous to maintain. Merchants stop traveling. Markets empty. Currency loses trust. Coins are hoarded, debased, or rejected altogether. Barter returns, but without the stability that once supported it. Economies fragment into isolated pockets of exchange, each struggling to survive on its own. Violence intensifies, but not as organized conquest. It appears as desperation. Looting replaces commerce. Gangs replace officials. Local strongmen take control of neighborhoods, villages, and roads. Protection becomes personal and conditional. Loyalty shifts from institutions to individuals who can offer immediate safety. Civilization fractures into smaller, competing units. The military disintegrates. Units abandon central command. Fortresses are left unmanned. Orders become meaningless. Soldiers sell their equipment, defect to local leaders, or disappear into the population. What was once the greatest symbol of state power becomes a source of instability itself. Discipline collapses alongside morale. Elites flee or fortify. Some retreat to protected estates. Others attempt last-minute reforms that arrive too late to matter. Authority fractures completely. Orders contradict one another. No one knows who truly rules. Legitimacy vanishes. Power exists only where it can be enforced directly, with force and fear. For ordinary people, life shrinks dramatically. The The future no longer extends beyond the next harvest or the next winter. Skills replace titles. Community replaces identity. Survival depends on adaptability rather than loyalty. Knowledge that once seemed essential disappears. What matters now is what can be carried, grown, repaired, or defended. Cities empty. Populations decline through migration, violence, and disease. Monuments decay. Roads crack. Administrative knowledge vanishes as those who maintained it die or flee. Writing becomes rare. Accounting disappears. The complex machinery of civilization stops functioning, not with a final command, but with silence. Collapse is not the end of humanity. It is the end of a system, a way of organizing life that no longer sustains itself. What remains are people, memories, habits, and fragments of knowledge. History records collapse as tragedy. Those who live through it experience it as adaptation. Civilization does not fall in a single blow. It unravels slowly, unevenly, and painfully. And once unraveled, it cannot simply be put back together the way it was before. After collapse, the world does not end in fire or noise. It becomes quiet. The constant movement of authority, trade, and organized life fades away, replaced by uncertainty, hesitation, and fear. People do not wake up to a new era. They slowly realize that the old one is gone. What remains is silence, broken only by the sounds of survival. Former cities no longer function as centers of life. Streets empty as populations shrink or flee. Buildings decay without maintenance. Roofs collapse slowly, one season at a time. What once required constant administration is abandoned because no authority remains to enforce responsibility. Public spaces lose meaning almost immediately. Without systems, cities become ruins faster than anyone expects. Communication collapses alongside infrastructure. Messages no longer travel far or reliably. News spreads slowly, distorted by distance and fear. Each community becomes its own island of information. People stop thinking in terms of empires and begin thinking only in terms of villages, families, and seasons. The world feels smaller, narrower, and more fragile. Trade networks disappear almost entirely. Long-distance exchange becomes too dangerous and too costly. Specialized labor vanishes as professions collapse. Blacksmiths, scribes, engineers, and administrators fade away, not because they are useless, but because the systems that supported them no longer exist. People must relearn how to do everything themselves or rely only on immediate neighbors. Complexity gives way to simplicity, not by choice, but by necessity. Knowledge does not disappear instantly. It fades unevenly and unpredictably. Some skills survive because they are directly useful. Others vanish because they require coordination, tools, or education that no longer exists. Mathematics, engineering, medicine, and record-keeping decline rapidly. Written memory gives way to oral tradition. What is not repeated is forgotten. What is not practiced is lost. Religion adapts to the silence. Grand temples lose relevance without priests, offerings, or protection. Organized belief fractures. Faith becomes personal, local, and improvised. Rituals simplify. Gods remain, but their institutions fall apart. Superstition replaces doctrine. Fear replaces structure. Violence does not disappear, but it becomes local and personal. Without large armies, conflict returns to small-scale disputes over land, water, and resources. Loyalty is negotiated. Protection is conditional. Trust becomes the most valuable currency because there is no system left to enforce contracts or promises. Time itself begins to feel different. Without calendars, schedules, or official records, people mark life by harvests, weather, and memory. Generations grow up without knowing the names of former rulers or the borders of lost states. History compresses. The past becomes legend. This silence is not peaceful, but it is stable in its own way. Life becomes harder, but simpler. Ambition narrows. Survival replaces progress. The idea of rebuilding civilization exists only faintly, as a distant memory of something greater. After collapse, humanity does not vanish. It adapts. But the world it inhabits is smaller, quieter, and stripped of the complexity that once defined it. Civilization has ended, but life continues patiently, cautiously, and without witnesses. After the silence settles, history enters what later generations will call the Long Night. This is not a single era, but a condition, a prolonged state where knowledge shrinks, horizons narrow, and survival replaces ambition. Life continues, but progress slows to a crawl. The memory of civilization fades with each passing generation. Without centralized authority, large-scale coordination disappears. Roads crumble and are no longer repaired. Bridges collapse and remain broken. Travel becomes dangerous and rare. Communities turn inward, focusing only on what lies within walking distance. The wider world feels distant, almost unreal. Former cities lose their purpose, streets empty, buildings decay without maintenance. Roofs collapse season by season. Public spaces lose meaning because no authority exists to protect or organize them. What once required constant administration is abandoned. Civilization does not fall all at once. It erodes quietly. People stop thinking in terms of empires and begin thinking in terms of families, villages, and immediate survival. Identity shrinks. Loyalty becomes local. The idea of belonging to something vast and shared begins to fade from imagination. Education changes dramatically during the Long Night. Without schools, writing materials, or trained teachers, literacy declines rapidly. Knowledge becomes practical rather than theoretical. People learn what keeps them alive, not what expands understanding. Skills are passed down through demonstration instead of documentation. Memory replaces record, and error accumulates with every generation. Technologies once taken for granted vanish quietly. Complex tools break and cannot be replaced. Techniques that require precision, mathematics, or specialized materials disappear first. What remains are simple tools, adaptable methods, and improvisation. Innovation still exists, but it is slow, local, and easily lost. Political structures simplify as well. Leadership becomes personal and temporary. Authority is based on strength, reputation, or protection rather than law. Power shifts frequently. Stability is fragile. Communities accept this instability because nothing larger exists to replace it. Religion fills the vacuum left by lost knowledge. Myths grow where records once existed. Stories explain ruins no one remembers building. The past becomes sacred, mysterious, and distorted. Achievements are reinterpreted as miracles or legends. Violence does not disappear during the Long Night, but it becomes smaller in scale. Without empires to fuel massive wars, conflict stays local. Feuds replace campaigns. Raids replace invasions. The scale of suffering shrinks, but so does the scale of cooperation. Humanity survives, but at reduced capacity. Trade becomes rare and dangerous. Long-distance exchange fades. Specialized labor disappears. People must relearn how to do everything themselves or rely only on nearby neighbors. Complexity gives way to simplicity, not by choice, but by necessity. Time itself begins to feel different. Without calendars, schedules, or official records, people mark life by harvests, weather, and memory. Generations grow up without knowing the names of former rulers or the borders of lost states. History compresses. The past becomes legend. The Long Night is not endless, but it is deep. It represents the cost of collapse measured in time. Rebuilding does not begin with ambition. It begins with memory. And memory, once broken, takes centuries to heal.
When civilization collapses, not everything is lost. Some things endure, not because they are grand, but because they are useful. Survival selects what remains. Tools that are simple, durable, and adaptable continue to be used. Knowledge tied directly to food, shelter, and safety survives longest. Farming practices persist in altered form. People remember how to plant, harvest, and store food, even if calendars and measurements are forgotten. Construction becomes simpler, relying on local materials and familiar techniques. What once required engineers is replaced by experience and repetition. Social bonds survive as well. Families, clans, and small communities become the core of life. Trust is rebuilt at the local level. Cooperation returns in limited scope. Shared labor replaces centralized organization. These bonds are fragile, but they are resilient. Language survives, though it changes. Words lose precision, meanings shift, stories shorten, complex ideas simplify into symbols and sayings. Communication remains, but nuance fades. Memory becomes selective, shaped by usefulness rather than accuracy. Even values persist in fragments. Ideas of fairness, obligation, and honor continue to guide behavior, though stripped of formal law. Custom replaces code. Reputation replaces enforcement. Survival favors what can be remembered without institutions. Among the fragments that survive are seeds of renewal. Children grow up learning from elders who remember pieces of the old world. Not details, but patterns. How cooperation works. How trade once connected communities. How order once existed beyond the village. Some skills are preserved intentionally. Craftsmen pass down techniques carefully, knowing they are rare. Oral instruction becomes sacred. Apprenticeship replaces education. Knowledge becomes personal again, protected by relationships rather than systems. Belief also evolves. Myths begin to encode lessons. Stories warn against excess, pride, and imbalance. Ruins become reminders of past power. Even without understanding how civilizations were built, people sense that they can fall. Memory transforms into caution. Trade slowly reappears in limited form. Paths reopen. Markets return cautiously. Exchange rebuilds trust step by step. No one assumes permanence. Resilience matters more than growth. Stability is measured in seasons, not generations. What survives is not the empire, but the human capacity to adapt. Civilization may be gone, but culture continues. It reshapes itself around new limits. Over time, survival creates space for structure. As communities stabilize, roles re-emerge. Leaders appear, not as rulers, but as coordinators. Decisions are made collectively or by consensus. Authority grows slowly, tested by necessity rather than tradition. Memory deepens, stories accumulate, some are preserved accurately, others evolve. The past becomes both guide and warning. People no longer remember how the old world functioned, but they remember that it failed. This awareness shapes behavior. Expansion is cautious, complexity is resisted, redundancy is valued. Systems are kept small because small systems are easier to repair. The scars of collapse influence every choice. What survives, ultimately, is not technology or power, but experience. Humanity carries forward lessons written in loss. These lessons do not prevent future collapse, but they delay it. They offer a chance to rebuild differently, even if that chance is rarely taken. From the ashes of civilization, life continues. Not unchanged, but wiser in fragments. Survival becomes the foundation upon which new structures may someday rise.
When civilizations collapse, knowledge does not vanish evenly. Some forms disappear almost immediately. Anything that depends on institutions, specialized tools, or large coordination fades first. Complex mathematics, engineering methods, advanced medicine, and long-distance navigation become impossible to maintain without systems to support them. Written records suffer the most. Libraries decay, burn, or are abandoned. Without readers, writing loses purpose. Scripts simplify, then disappear. What was once carefully recorded becomes rumor, then myth. Knowledge that required preservation collapses faster than knowledge tied to daily survival. Expertise also disappears when experts die. Skills that took decades to master vanish in a single generation if they are not passed on directly. Without apprentices, without materials, without demand, even the most advanced techniques become unusable. What remains is uneven. One village may remember advanced farming methods, while another forgets metalworking entirely. Knowledge fractures geographically. The past no longer exists as a shared reference. It becomes local, inconsistent, and incomplete. As knowledge fragments, misunderstanding grows. People inherit tools they no longer know how to use properly. Ruins are repurposed without understanding their design. Structures built for one purpose serve another. Meaning shifts as function is forgotten. Stories fill the gaps. Explanations emerge where facts are missing. Technology becomes magic. Engineering becomes legend. The line between history and myth dissolves. People sense that the past was powerful, but they no longer understand how or why. Yet fragments still matter. Even misunderstood knowledge can inspire imitation. Simple machines are copied imperfectly. Techniques are rediscovered through trial and error. Progress resumes slowly, guided by intuition rather than instruction. Rediscovery is rarely intentional. It happens accidentally. Someone notices a pattern. Someone experiments. Someone adapts an old idea to a new problem. Knowledge returns not as restoration, but as reinvention. Over generations, fragments begin to connect. Trade spreads ideas. Travel spreads techniques. Communities compare methods. Some approaches fail. Others succeed and spread. Slowly, complexity returns, but it looks different than before. Rediscovered knowledge carries scars. It is cautious. Systems are built smaller. Redundancy is valued. Fragility is remembered, even if its causes are forgotten. Progress resumes, but memory shapes its limits. The return of knowledge is uneven and temporary. Some discoveries are lost again. Others survive longer. History does not move forward in a straight line. It advances, retreats, and repeats. What matters is not that knowledge returns, but that it never disappears completely. Humanity forgets, but it also remembers. Civilization collapses, but understanding leaves traces. These traces are enough to rebuild, even if rebuilding never lasts forever. When we look at the modern world, ancient patterns begin to reappear. Complex systems connect billions of people across vast distances. Trade networks span the planet. Knowledge moves instantly. Specialization has reached levels unseen in history. This creates immense power, but also immense dependence. Just like ancient empires, modern societies rely on coordination that few people fully understand. Supply chains stretch across continents. Energy, food, and information arrive on schedule because countless systems work together. When they function, life feels stable. When they fail, the consequences are immediate. Distance once weakened ancient empires. Today, speed hides weakness. Problems appear manageable because solutions travel quickly, but speed can mask fragility. A disruption in one place ripples outward, affecting millions who have no connection to its cause. Authority feels distant again. Decisions that shape daily life are made far from those affected by them. Trust depends on systems rather than relationships. As in the past, stability feels permanent until it doesn't. Modern complexity mirrors ancient overreach. Efficiency has replaced resilience. Systems are optimized to work under normal conditions, not to survive disruption. Redundancy is minimized. Zapas is treated as waste. This makes growth faster, but recovery slower. Inequality follows familiar lines. Wealth concentrates. Access divides. Those insulated from disruption underestimate its impact. Warnings are filtered. Risk is deferred. Confidence grows at the center, while strain accumulates at the edges. Technology amplifies both strength and weakness. Communication connects people, but it also spreads panic. Automation increases output, but it narrows skills. As specialization deepens, fewer people know how systems truly function. Knowledge concentrates even as information multiplies. History shows that fragility grows alongside complexity. The more a system promises permanence, the more surprising its failure becomes. Ancient history does not offer simple warnings or clear solutions. It offers patterns. Civilizations rise by organizing complexity and fall when that complexity becomes brittle. Memory fades. Confidence replaces caution. Expansion outpaces restraint. The lesson is not that collapse is inevitable, but that it is possible. Awareness delays failure. It does not prevent it. Resilience requires accepting limits, preserving redundancy, and valuing memory over speed. Modern societies inherit ancient tools in new forms. Laws, money, institutions, and belief systems still shape behavior. The difference is scale. The consequences of failure are broader, faster, and more interconnected. History does not repeat exactly, but it echoes. Whether those echoes become warnings or prophecies depends on what we choose to remember. Ancient history leaves us with a choice, not a prediction. Civilizations rise by organizing people, resources, and ideas into systems that promise stability. They fall when those systems become rigid, fragile, and disconnected from the people they serve. This pattern is not fate. It is behavior repeated at scale. Every society believes it is different, more advanced, more aware, more prepared. Ancient peoples believed the same. Confidence grows when systems work smoothly. Dependence deepens when success lasts long enough. Over time, caution fades and memory weakens. The danger is not complexity itself. It is forgetting why systems exist. When rules replace judgment, when efficiency replaces resilience, and when growth replaces balance, fragility quietly accumulates. Collapse does not arrive as punishment. It arrives as consequence. History shows that awareness can delay failure. It buys time. It opens options. It does not guarantee survival, but it increases the chance to adapt before pressure becomes unbearable. The past does not ask us to fear collapse. It asks us to recognize the signs before they multiply. Ancient civilizations left behind more than ruins. They left lessons encoded in loss. They show us that power must be renewed, not assumed, that systems must be repaired, not idolized, that memory is as important as innovation. Resilience grows from redundancy. Communities survive when they can adapt locally. Knowledge survives when it is shared widely. Stability lasts when leaders listen as much as they command. These truths are old because they work. History does not demand that we abandon progress. It asks that we guide it, to value what can be repaired, to protect what can be remembered, to build systems that bend rather than break. The future is shaped not only by technology, but by choices. Choices about scale, speed, and care. Choices about who benefits and who bears risk. The past does not judge those choices. It records their outcomes. Civilizations do not die because people forget how to build. They die because people forget why they built in the first place. When survival is taken for granted, warning signs feel distant. When memory fades, mistakes return. Ancient history is not finished. It continues through us. Every generation rewrites the story with new tools and familiar instincts. The question is not whether history will repeat. The question is how loudly it will echo. If we listen, the past offers guidance without demanding obedience. It invites reflection without fear. It reminds us that collapse is not the end of humanity, but it is the end of a way of living. This is ancient times, where the past is not buried, it is speaking, and what we do next determines whether it becomes a warning or a prophecy.